Well, for his assessment, I'm joined now on the line from London by the international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Always a pleasure to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz, and thank you for joining us. So the American proposal was for a ceasefire that is interim and immediate, but President Putin's counter proposal appears to be anything but. Your take?
Yes, there are three aspects to this. First of all, there is indeed a possibility that President Putin is merely playing for time. The reason is quite simple. He is winning. So why should he have a ceasefire now? And he can't say no to the Americans directly for fear that it will lose his relationship with President Trump and call upon more sanctions and other problems. So that is indeed one possibility. Indeed, we can expand on this first point. If he is actually winning, why would he want a ceasefire? After all, the further he goes ahead, the more he conquers, the better for him. However, there is a third aspect to this, quite simply that the questions he's posed, for example, who is supposed to police it, are reasonable enough. And it is, of course, not unusual for Russia or indeed other countries, before they take such a huge step, to actually work out the details. The ceasefire has no details to it at all, apart from the one of stopping fighting, whereas usually there are far more clauses and conditions. So on this third and more hopeful explanation, it is that indeed some more details should be forthcoming about not only President Putin's questions, but there might be also more points from the Americans about such a possibility and how it would look.
Well, absolutely. And in terms of Mr. Putin's objections and concerns, just to expand a bit so the audience can understand it, he wanted the ceasefire to address the root causes of the war, and he said he wanted a painstaking study in order to answer numerous questions about its implementation. So you're quite right that there are what appear to be legitimate concerns there. Nevertheless, President Zelensky, of course, accusing the Russian leader of stalling and of being unconstructive. I mean, do you agree with any of the things he's saying there?
No, in my opinion, this is just pure politics. I mean, President Zelensky has quite rightly immediately criticized President Putin to rub in not only that Putin hasn't agreed, but that he himself, President Zelensky, has agreed, and that Russia is not to be trusted, and so on. So this is standard messaging, and therefore I don't think it needs to be taken any more seriously than that. What is interesting, though, is that American President Trump's position of saying it's a good answer but incomplete. This is an interesting point, and we shall see quite what he has in mind after his conversation with President Putin.
Well, I would imagine that when he says incomplete, he means that essentially, I mean, they haven't agreed a deal. That's the way, Trump thinks. The completion would be agreeing a deal. I mean, I'm assuming that's what it is.
Yeah, I agree that it's entirely a quite feasible explanation. The problem with Donald Trump is it's quite difficult to be always certain what's going on in his mind. The word completion would imply a deal. Incomplete implies somehow that President Putin's left out pieces. But I agree, yours may be the correct explanation. Myself, I felt it was something else. It's as if there was no counter offer as opposed to conditions from Putin's side. That's what I felt was more likely, that he was hopeful, because he has said over and over again he can work with President Putin better than with President Zelensky. And so therefore, there are numerous explanations. Unfortunately, we're all guessing until we finally until the conversation between them, and it becomes clear what he has in mind.
Indeed. But based on what we've seen so far, I suppose the ball is now back in Donald Trump's court.
Yes, to that extent, he has been deflected back to his court by President Putin, who has neither said yes nor said no. And therefore, Donald Trump, in principle, has to somehow deal with this. What is important is the conversation between them, because Donald Trump, as a businessman, puts great stock, as far as I can tell, in conversations with people. And therefore, if they are going to have this live conversation, this will be very important.
So, what now are the prospects for a ceasefire in Ukraine following this list of tough conditions, if you like, by President Putin?
To be quite honest, I honestly don't see a ceasefire immediately for three simple reasons. Russia is winning. Russia, in any case, would be looking for a peace treaty which is virtually impossible for the West to accept, Ukraine and so on, unless pressurized by President Trump. And finally, President Putin himself, never mind Russia winning, he is winning when this war is going ahead so successfully as it is at present. And therefore, it's very hard to see a peace treaty or a ceasefire or anything in the immediate future. It may well go down as yet another failed peace attempt. The interesting aspect to it is what Donald Trump will do to actually force the issue. Now here, this is not a short-term measure. We're not discussing what's going to happen tomorrow, but shall we say over the next few days or weeks, because he insisted he could cause Russia much financial pain. I think what he has in mind is that the dollar is a reserve currency, and therefore what happens in world terms, you have to have access through the American banking system. And if you can't work within the normal international banking system, that therefore it'd be very hard for Russia to export its goods. If that's what he's planning on, then it has to be borne in mind that Russia and China were in discussion before this war about forming a separate world reserve currency, in which case all he'll have done is push Russia and China together. So it's difficult to make sure. But the key point is this. Is Donald Trump prepared to push President Putin by carrying out this financial plan, the details of which I'm only guessing at? There may be more to it.
Meanwhile, of course, divisions over Ukraine between the US and other world powers have been dominating the final day of talks at that meeting of G7 foreign ministers in Quebec. What are you hearing from that meeting, which seems to be about support for Ukraine and a ceasefire, set against a belief that Moscow must be called out for its full-scale invasion, but the White House rejects such public rebuke of Moscow, doesn't it?
It does indeed, and to be quite honest, G7 looks to be going the same way as NATO, once a cornerstone of Western thinking. If America hears words like this to be put through the mouth of G7, then what has it got in common with G7? It doesn't need G7. And therefore, it may well be that this is the last major conference. As for what it said, well, it's really a lot of hot air, because they can't force President Putin to do anything. All the rest of it says that Russia should do this or should do that. Well, Russia is exactly against this sort of thing, as indeed is China, because if it is to be a multipolar world, then it's not Europe's business to dictate terms to Russia, which it can't do in any case. So therefore, from this point of view, the G7 conference is at best a waste of time, and at worst has simply going to intensify the split between America and Europe.
I think I'd agree with your assessment there, although what they're quibbling about right now is a joint statement which they tended to bring out. I mean, it's a sharp contrast with previous joint statements by the G7, which used to contain pages and pages of condemnation of Russia. And, you know, today is expected to contain little. I mean, how much does this highlight the stark division between Europe and the Trump administration over where responsibility for this war in Ukraine should be attributed?
It absolutely just brings it to the fore, does it not? The fact of the matter is America's going in one direction, Europe wants to go in the other. Europe wants to support Ukraine, give a blank check. But it's unable, in fact, to fulfill many of its promises, because they are just empty promises in that sense, apart from some money. And therefore, America, I would say, may well find that G7 no longer has any meaning for it, as NATO has no meaning for it. So therefore, as you pointed out, there is no consensus. There will be no pages of condemnation of Russia. It's even possible they may be unable to agree a joint statement, because after all, what is America's interest in these European pious hopes? It's not. It's of no interest to it. For example, they've said quite frankly, when it comes to peacekeeping and peacekeeping troops, and in fact supporting Ukraine, America is still the biggest and the most important country in the game. So the rest of G7, frankly, is just small fry in comparison.
And of course, meanwhile, fear of Russia amongst its neighbors continues. We understand that Poland has been asking the United States to come and situate more its nuclear weapons on Polish soil. I mean, that's a country that you have affiliations with. What do you make of that?
I have to say that Poland has bungled so much of its history in the past, and this is, from my point of view, just one more bungle, virtually tantamount to a death wish, to be honest. What Russia is looking at is a country that is arming, a country which historically has fought the Russians for centuries. In fact, President Putin himself put it that it was Poland who first invaded Russia back in the 17th century, not vice versa. Well, let's not go into all these details. The point is that President Putin, as in fact did his predecessors such as Stalin, see Poland as a potential threat. And what's more, Poland is in the process of telling other countries they should arm up. And therefore what Russia is looking at, and I think will surely soon make comments about, is that Poland is becoming a threat. If it also gets nuclear missiles on its soil, then please note that Russia will have in its books, in its propaganda books, every excuse in the world to nuke Poland. After all, it will be purely a defensive measure. The problem is, you see, the Russians see the world upside down. I'll give you an example about the ceasefire, which we never brought out before. What the world sees is a ceasefire, and now the Americans are supplying goods to Ukraine. What the Russians see is that America is supplying, again, military hardware to Ukraine under the cover of a ceasefire. Please remember, Russians see things differently. And the same thing goes about this Poland rearming. As far as the Russians are concerned, they haven't said so yet, but sooner or later they will, that what there's happening is there's a growing threat. That's how they'll put it, to their borders. And they will take action. There'll be initially words, of course. I'm not saying they're going to do it tomorrow or the immediate future. But please watch this space, because Poland is going out of its way to, how can I put it, to throw itself at Russia.
Well, that better explains it all. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is the International Affairs Analyst. He was talking to me on the line from London.